decades, Admiral Richard Byrd's Antarctic expeditions have been surrounded by speculation, with stories of hidden Nazi bases, strange UFO encounters, and mysteries buried deep in the ice. Most of the men who took part never lived long enough to share their version of events, and as time passed, legend often replaced memory. But one man endured.
Operation High Jump, that was 46 and 7 under the ice party. Three of us made a parachute drop. You know, it's just part of your duty, I guess.
Robert Bob Johnson, the final survivor of Byrd's mission, carried with him the last living account of what really unfolded at the bottom of the world. His voice stands as the only direct link back to those frozen days, when survival was never guaranteed and history was still being written. What truth did Johnson finally reveal about Operation High Jump? The last witness from the ice. When people talk about the legendary age of exploration, names like Shackleton, Amundsen, and Scott often surface first. Yet one man bridged that old heroic era with the new mechanical age of discovery. His name was Robert Bob Johnson, a sailor barely out of his teens when he joined Admiral Richard Byrd's Antarctic expeditions. Johnson's story is striking not just because of his age at the time, but because he lived long enough to tell it. He would eventually become the last surviving member of Byrd's pre-war journeys, carrying memories of an Antarctica few alive could imagine. Johnson was born in Hollywood, California, in 1920. His father served in the Navy, which meant long stretches away from home. That absence pushed young Robert toward the sea in his own way. He became a Sea Scout and, at just 16, found himself adrift in the Pacific for 67 days after a small voyage went wrong. Survival at sea taught him lessons about patience, courage, and the kind of quiet toughness that would define his future. By the time he formally joined the Navy in 1937, he already had more real experience on the water than many of his peers. It was this combination of youthful daring and proven resilience that caught the eye of Admiral Byrd. By 1939, Byrd was preparing his third Antarctic expedition, one now backed directly by the U.S. government. The goal was ambitious: establish permanent bases, explore thousands of miles of coastline, and assert American presence on a continent that other nations, including Nazi Germany, had begun to claim. Byrd needed sailors who could handle hardship, and Johnson, just 19, became the youngest member of the expedition's crew. The ship that carried them south was the aging USS Bear, a wooden vessel that had once rescued Arctic explorers decades earlier. By modern standards, she was a relic, powered by both sails and steam. Johnson helped prepare her for the journey in Boston, working to install a new diesel engine so she could push through ice floes. He remembered the day they finally left port clearly. Snow falling on the city, factories and cars sounding their horns in farewell as the crew sailed down the Charles River. For a teenager from California, it was the beginning of a journey that would carry him far beyond familiar waters. The 1939 expedition was a curious blend of old and new. Alongside dog teams and wooden ships came aircraft, tanks, and one oversized machine known as the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Designed to be a mobile base, the futuristic vehicle proved a disappointment on the ice, breaking down quickly and eventually serving as little more than a bunkhouse. Johnson would later chuckle when recalling how much faith had been put in the machine, only for sleds and skis to once again prove more reliable. That combination of optimism and harsh reality defined Byrd's ventures. Johnson's tasks were varied. He moved supplies, helped maintain equipment, and worked closely with the Navy crews charged with supporting Byrd's flights and survey missions. The expedition established bases at key points, including Marguerite Bay, where decades later a landmark would be named Johnson Point in his honor. However, global events cut the mission short. With Europe sliding into war, Johnson was pulled into service elsewhere, transporting fuel to the European theater. He narrowly avoided death one night when a German torpedo streaked beneath his ship, missing only because their vessel sat higher in the water after unloading oil. Had it been full, the torpedo would have struck, and Johnson's story might have ended there. By the time he celebrated his 102nd birthday, Johnson had outlived all his fellow explorers from Byrd's era. Friends and family gathered at a Florida diner to honor him, along with active Navy members who recognized what he had accomplished. On the table sat mementos of his adventures. A flag with 48 stars that once flew in Antarctica, and a stuffed penguin he had kept for decades named Polar Pete. They were humble tokens of a life spent on the edge of the known world, reminders of journeys that helped map 500,000 square miles of uncharted land. Those tokens told only half the tale. Johnson's return with Operation High Jump. Operation High Jump was the largest Antarctic expedition ever attempted, launched in 1946 with thousands of men, 13 ships, and dozens of aircraft. Its official mission was to establish a new base, test equipment in polar conditions, and map the frozen continent. By the time Operation High Jump was launched, Johnson was no longer the wide-eyed teenager who had first followed Admiral Byrd into the ice. The war had aged him quickly. He had crossed the Atlantic on tankers under constant threat of German submarines, and when he stepped aboard the flagship USS Mount Olympus as part of Task Force 68, he was no longer the youngest sailor. He was a combat-tested man stepping into what many quietly admitted was an uncertain mission. Operation High Jump was vast in scale. More than 13 ships, over 4,000 men, and dozens of aircraft gathered under the dual command of Admiral Richard Cruzen and Admiral Byrd. Officially, their goals included establishing Little America 4, testing ships and aircraft in the most unforgiving climate on Earth, and expanding America's knowledge of the continent. Unofficially, there was also the shadow of a new geopolitical contest. With the Cold War beginning to take shape, Antarctica was suddenly seen as a region of strategic importance. The Soviets were watching closely, sending their own whaling fleet south to remind the Americans that they were not alone. Johnson's assignment placed him in the nerve center of the expedition. As a radio operator aboard the Mount Olympus, he was surrounded by constant communication, orders, and reports flowing back and forth. He was there when the task force broke through heavy ice, when the Coast Guard cutters fought to carve a path through floes as thick as city blocks, and when the helicopters first lifted off to scout ahead. For a man who had grown up around sails, steam, and wooden hulls, it was astonishing to see helicopters, carrier-borne planes, and snow tractors all converging on a continent where the silence could swallow a man whole. Johnson's memories of the operation were not filled with talk of science or politics. He remembered the daily grind. He recalled helping with sled dogs, hauling supplies ashore, and the physical demands of setting up a base in bitter cold. He was one of the few who made a parachute jump over the continent, a moment he described years later with his trademark understatement. The landing, he said, felt like being hit by a ton of bricks, followed by the most complete silence he had ever known. Those words gave a human texture to Operation High Jump that official Navy reports could never capture. The expedition was not without tragedy. Johnson lived through the tension when news spread that the seaplane George I had gone down in the icy wilderness. 3 men were dead, and others clung to life while awaiting rescue. Johnson did not dramatize these events in later years, but the way he spoke of them carried the weight of loss. To him, it was a reminder that the line between survival and disaster was thin, and that every man on the ice knew it. And when legends later clouded High Jump, Johnson's plain memories cut through the noise. Johnson's truth about High Jump. What sets Robert "Bob" Johnson apart from the swirl of stories around Operation High Jump is how clear he was about what really happened. His memories carried no trace of the legends that later attached themselves to the expedition. Tales of hidden Nazi bases under the ice, aerial battles with flying saucers, or Admiral Byrd discovering a secret entrance to the Hollow Earth became popular in later decades, long after most of the men who served were gone. Johnson never gave them weight. To him, the mission was defined by cold, fatigue, broken machinery, and the constant need to trust the man working next to you. His testimony brought the expedition back to its human scale. The persistence of those myths is easy to understand. In 1939, a German expedition visited Queen Maud Land, and at the end of the war, 2 German submarines appeared in Argentina. At the same time, Britain launched secret operations in the southern oceans, and in 1946, the United States sent the largest naval force ever seen to Antarctica. Later still, nuclear tests in the South Atlantic fed suspicions that governments were hiding something. With so many half-understood events, It was tempting for writers and conspiracy theorists to stitch them together into a grand narrative. Yet careful research has shown that these pieces do not fit. The submarines never reached the Antarctic ice. No hidden German base was ever established, and British forces were not secretly fighting battles at the bottom of the world. High jump itself was a Cold War training exercise, designed to prepare the Navy for potential conflict with the Soviet Union in polar conditions, not an invasion of a phantom fortress. Against this backdrop, Johnson's voice becomes all the more important. When he described parachuting onto Antarctica, he spoke of the silence that followed the impact. When he recalled working as a radio operator aboard the USS Mount Olympus, his words were about static, coded messages, and the relentless pressure of keeping communication lines alive. For him, heroism was never part of the story. He insisted he was simply doing his duty. Yet by outliving every other man who took part, he became the final link to what Operation High Jump truly was. Through Johnson, the expedition is remembered not as the setting for myths, but as a moment when ordinary sailors and airmen pushed themselves against the edge of the known world and carried those memories quietly for the rest of their lives. Robert Bob Johnson may be gone, but his memories remain the last true window into Admiral Byrd's Antarctic expedition. His voice cut through the layers of mystery and left us with a story grounded in survival, struggle, and human endurance. Could there still be secrets about Operation High Jump hidden away in forgotten files or frozen beneath the ice? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.